So, hi, my name is Brian, and I'm interviewing Dr. Liang.
Hi, I'm Jingjing Liang, and I'm an associate professor of quantitative forestry ecology from the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at Purdue University. It's glad to be here.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the focus of your lab, the Forest Advanced Computing and Artificial Intelligence Lab?
Yes, our Forest Advanced Computing and Artificial Intelligence, or FACAI lab, is focused on making use of the big data collected from across the years, especially the forest inventory data, as well as the state-of-the-art artificial intelligence tools to make an analysis based on the basically the distribution and the patterns of forest resources across the world. And based on that, we are also going to study how to best manage, conserve, and restore the forests around the world.
Okay. Can you go a little bit into detail about the sort of impacts your research has? So, for example, I know that you previously just said like it's going to help, forest management, inventory, etc.
Mhm. Yes, so we have been conducting several research projects together, but to give you an example of the things we do, so in this past year, we published a paper, and that what was on the total number of species that have lived on the face of the earth. And so, according to our estimations, at present, there are a total about 73,000 tree species on Earth, and however, among them, only about 60,000 have been documented. So, which means that there are lots of trees still are yet to be found. And however, with the recent deforestation and forest degradation, especially in the global south, and many of those tree species may be gone forever before we even had a chance of knowing them.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, okay, it's like something I was just like kind of curious about. So, how do you predict the number of unknown trees species if you don't know the unknown tree species? Can you go like a little bit about like into your methodology if you can?
Yes, this methodology is actually quite not new, and it actually dates back to the basically the Alan Turing theorem that he developed during the Second World War, and in the effort to crack the Nazi Enigma code. And so we've I think most of us that have watched the movie, right? And
Oh yeah,
about
yeah.
how this how Alan Turing and his team designed this first the prototype of modern computers in order to crack the code. But actually, he did a lot, beyond making that computer. And one of the theorems that he developed during that time is that he found that the rare signals, okay, and so in this case we can understand as the rare tree species, and which accounts for most of the tree species here on Earth. Okay, and the rare signals and can be only be estimated or can only be understood or projected from the rare signals that we already know. Okay, so which means that in when we translate that to our project, and we can sort of understand that as in order to estimate the number of rare tree species, and
Mhm.
those rare tree species are they are so rare that most of them maybe only has maybe one or two the individuals, and which is really hard difficult to find. And we can only estimate or understand the number of those rare tree species from the number of the rare tree species we've already known.
I see.
Okay, and so and to our advantage, our lab is now compiling and updating the world's largest forest inventory database. And
Mhm.
so those data are measured and compiled by different groups, different people, the ground crews from across the world.
Mhm.
And so they are like hand measured and ground sourced and very precious data and very expensive too. And we have had the privilege of organizing and compiling those data. And then we use, based on those data we collected from around the world, about 1.5 million sample plots
Mhm.
located across the world, we were able to differentiate the abundant species from the rare species.
Mhm.
And also based on the abundance and the distribution of those species, we were able to get a good estimate of the total number of tree species there are across the world.
I see. Okay, and that's really cool. So when you like mentioned about using like sort of, data that volunteers used, that kind of like reminded me of another paper of yours where it was like planted forest classification, I
Uh-huh.
think. So, can you provide like some background on the challenges and, maybe the gaps in knowledge that prompted you to, pursue that sort of research topic?
Yes. So for this planted forest project, our goal is to basically to map and delineate the areas of planted forest in East Asia.
Mhm.
And the reason behind that is that in East Asian countries, especially China, there are the most amount of planted forest across the world. So in other words, and those East Asian countries planted the most areas of forests, and in the past the decades. And so the question is now, with all those vast amount of forests being planted, and after so many years, do those forests grow well, and what can we learn? What lessons can we learn from the countries that planted the most amount of forest in the world, right? So this would help us better design our forest planting projects in other parts of the world as well. So in order to do this, our first task is to find out where those planted forests are across the region. Right, and the question is, the major gap is there is no map that shows us the exact locations of those planted forests in East Asia. We know that a large amount of forests have been planted, but we just do not know where exactly they are located. And so in order to find out, we have been collecting a large amount of ground sourced data. So which comes from the government, which comes from also the individual researchers who actually measured or visited those forests on the ground. And based on the information, as well as the remote sensing data. So we feed all the data into a machine learning model, and then the machine learning model is detect the patterns and or the relationship between the remote sensing data and from the what we observe on the ground, and get a prediction of where the planted forests are and what are the main dominant species of those planted forests of the region.
Okay. So I know like this AI, it's supposed to, take in that remote sensing data that data from, I guess, from real people and like put it all together to predict, planted forest classification, the type of, I think it was like tree classification you said.
Mm-hmm.
Can you
Classification
provide,
tree
oh yeah,
species.
yeah, tree species.
Yeah.
Can you provide like maybe some intuition, based on, your knowledge about forests, like maybe something that you think the model is picking up on. So like, is it like, do you think the model is like picking up on like the height of the trees? Like, I'm not really sure, but
So yeah, it's a complex the problem. So the remote sensing data on the forest, it detects different aspects of forests. So for for example, some of the data from the LiDAR-based platforms, and they can detect, for example, the height of the crown, as well as how the crown is stratified across different layers from the dominant layer to the mid layer or to the understory.
Mhm.
And some of the other remote sensing data can just detect, for example, the different green bands, red bands, and blue bands, and all those basically the visual characteristics from the forest. And so they represent different characteristics and the features of the forest. Now, the unique challenge is how can we integrate those remote sensing data with actually what is the actual forest characteristics that we want to know. So, for example, what tree species are growing down there, and what are the size of the trees that are growing down there. So I think the most challenge come from ground truthing the remote sensing data.
Yeah. So I guess like maybe during training your models, you have the ground truth data, I'm sorry, the data from the ground, you have your remote sensing data, but then when you actually do like real-time inference, you don't have those inputs. You only have the satellite data.
So yeah, when we train the model, we
Mhm.
use both remote sensing data and the matching ground source
Okay.
data, right? So we build a model to understand the relationship of how to use the remote sensing data to predict the ground measured characteristics.
Mhm.
And then we use that model and apply it to
Oh,
all the remote sensing data so that we can derive the wall-to-wall maps of the ground characteristics that we estimated from the map or the model.
okay. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, so I watched your The Future of AI in Natural Resource Management video on YouTube, and a large part of the talk you talked about your matrix model.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that project?
Yeah, so the matrix model is regarding the other front of the research topics that we are doing right now. And so it relates to a typical forest model that people use a lot, that is called forest growth and yield model. And so in forestry, it is very important for us to be able to project how a forest stand, or a forest stand is a forestry term, but it actually means a local homogeneous piece of forest. Okay, so how a forest stand would grow into the future, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, and what would happen, say, if we cut down the trees and plant them, or if we use a partial harvest, cut down part of the trees, some people prefers to do high grading, which means that people cut down the trees of good size, those high quality timber wood, and leave the rest there. And so all those different forest management, forest harvesting plans, what would happen to the forest? How would the residual forest grow into the future? And also another thing to project is how much monetary income can people get by harvesting according to those plans, because timbers can be converted into lots of money if you done it right? So lots of landowners, they would be interested in know how much monetary income in terms of the net present value of the land they can get, and by applying different forest management regimes on their stand. So to do that, people have been developed forest growth and yield models, and to specifically project how a forest stand would grow of different types of forest. Okay,
Mhm.
Now, the problem is that those forest growth and yield models that are developed in the history they are developed by humans and developed by experts, the biometricians and statisticians, based on lots of the data that people collected from the past. And you can understand how expensive it can be, right? Just by collecting the data and also hire an expert, a biometrician, to design this model, develop it. And then you need to train the people to understand and use those models, right? And then maybe also hire someone to interpret the outcomes of those models to actually be users of the models. So you can understand how expensive it can be. And actually, the truth is that because of the labor-intensive feature and the very expensive nature of forest growth and yield models, only the developed countries and a few of the developing countries, they have the luxury of having those models, to cover their forest. However, for 80% or maybe more of the global south, the countries, and they do not even have a single forest growth and yield models for them. So what happens to the countries? So their forest management, their carbon restoration and forest planting project, they are essentially operating blindfolded. So people, they plant trees or they cut down trees without knowing what are the consequences, right? And that's the huge gap that we have right now. And those developing countries, they wanted so much to have a forest growth yield model, but they just do not have the capacity or the expertise of having one. So in order to fill those gaps, and we are trying to design this AI-based system to develop basically forest growth and yield model, especially for the global south. And our rationale is that if AI can be as good as people in performing of some of the other tasks. So, for example, we all know the Chat GPT, right? We know that it does very good in proofreading your text, for example. So, can we use the same? Can we use a AI to help us, design or train forest growth models, especially for those underprivileged regions of the world, right? So that's the rationale behind this project. Now, the matrix model is one type, maybe one of the first types of AI-based forest growth and yield model. And what we have found so far is that we are making the generation 1 and generation 2 of the matrix model for North America. We're starting by focusing on North America and gradually expand to cover the whole Earth. And what we found so far is that the matrix model designed, trained by AI on its own, can be 50% more accurate than human-developed model, which actually shows great potential for the AI-based model to be used in the field of forest growth and yield.
Okay. So you mentioned how your matrix model, it's like trained, I guess, like in the US first, because I assume like the US has like a lot of farming data. I don't know. But and you're gonna like try to apply that globally.
Yes.
So my question is, do you think that there is like some sort of like underlying pattern in like all the data you're inputting, like maybe the satellite data, the like I don't know, like topography data that's like it's a general underlying pattern that can just be copied like anywhere around the world?
Um, I don't believe so. There is some general patterns that can apply from across the world. So we have to be very specific when we are developing forest growth and yield models, because different types of forest, they grow in different patterns, and their growth rate, mortality rate, recruitment rate are completely different. So, for example, if you have visited, the western part of the country, and if you take a look at the mighty Douglas fir and the western hemlock forest compared to, for example, the central hardwood forest that we have around here, they behave completely differently. So if we are going to treat them together, treat different types of forest as one, then we are going to bring in a huge bias in the projected forest growth and yield. So
Mhm.
to avoid that, we are developing different types of an independent matrix model for each different forest types.
Mhm.
Okay, and so for each forest type, we are using that model. We are feeding data to the model so that the AI can train a forest type specific model, and then run the projections and all the analysis based on different types of forest. And so this is one feature of the matrix model.
I see. I think what's like really interesting is that you're talking about like it's not this matrix model. It's not like you're just gonna slap it anywhere around the world, but like it seems like you're incorporating like real like domain knowledge you have about forests like into this. So
Exactly.
yeah, and I guess this is like the approach of like where I know like AI it can like zero out irrelevant features, but you're sort of guiding this AI model to fit like I guess the existing literature, the existing
Mhm.
knowledge. Can you talk a little bit more about like other ways that you are incorporating domain knowledge into this AI to like make it learn better and I guess like more correctly?
Yeah, excellent question. So yeah, in order to better incorporate the domain knowledge into the matrix model, we are employing basically two approaches. First one is that we are using the domain-specific data
Mhm.
to train the matrix models for different forest types, so that we have the exact data for the exactly the correct forest type. And to do this, we have collected millions of sample plot data from across the world, and most of them have been measured more than twice in time, so that we know how forests grow, right? So we needed to have these temporal differences in order to understand how much forest can grow in terms of diameter, tree diameter, how much forest and how many trees will die from time to time, and how much recruitment can we get in the forest from time to time as well. So we are using local data that we compiled from around the world, and in order to train our forest type specific model.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is we are also inviting experts from around the world, and we are trying to incorporate human knowledge and in fine tuning our AI-based model, so that we all know that the AI is only as good as the data behind it. So
Mhm.
what would happen if there is a limitation of the data? So for example, for some of the regions in global south, we may not have sufficient data to cover a particular forest type. But in that case, we are planning to invite the experts who have the specific domain knowledge to help us fine tune the AI-based model so that it would behave as expected
Mhm.
from those experts. And as you can see, we are also trying to fill in those data gaps using remote sensing data, as well as data that we can collect from the vast amount of the references we can find on the internet.
Yeah. Okay. So my final question, one thing that I thought was really interesting was that you in your talk, you mentioned how like there's like this component of climate change into it, so maybe you can use this matrix model as like a predictor of like what will happen if climate change occurs.
Mhm.
So one thing like that I was interested in was I know that this is like there are like previous sort of like climate change forecast models out there, but one thing that I was a little like confused about is that like I guess like if your training data does not like have I guess like climate change embedded in it, like maybe like 5 degrees higher or something,
Mhm.
how do you um can you be confident that this model will also, you know, like accurately predict what will happen if, like climate change was exacerbated? And it's kind of like a weird question.
So let me try to rephrase your question so to make sure that I understand it correctly.
Yeah.
So you were asking with uh, the with our current data set, according to the range of our the current climate conditions. Would there be a huge amount of bias if we are trying to predict into the future when the new climate data are going to be quite different from our current conditions?
Yeah,
Did I
yeah, exactly,
did I
exactly.
understand it right correctly?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's a very legitimate concern. And yes, so to answer your questions, I submit to basically the thought that all the models are wrong, but some can be useful, right? So first we have to admit that if we are trying to predict into the future, and especially when the climate conditions will be hugely different from now, and then there can be significant bias in any model, and even the climate model itself. So in terms of how many degrees, in terms of average temperature, annual temperature would change in future and all those things. And so, and however, I mean, considering the limitations in that part, that should not stop us from exploring the possibilities of what could happen if the climate changes, right? And so that could at least give us guidance, useful information, useful scenario-based information to help guide us our current forest conservation and management plans. And
Mhm.
that's the whole purpose of designing this, the climate sensitive projections by the matrix model. And so to help mitigate some of the concerns that the future climate conditions can be hugely different from now, because in our current data, because we have such a huge spatial expanse of the data.
Mhm.
So the climate conditions in our current data actually varies a lot according to the spatial variation. So some of the large forest types, they have a huge expanse. So for example, the boreal forest, and they have a expanse in North America, it expands from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So we have that huge amount of boreal forest, and they're actually the current conditions, climate conditions in terms of temperature, precipitation, growing degree days, and the average drought index, all those things that there is a huge expense. There varies a lot from one spatial point to another spatial point.
Mhm.
So this can be those information, those type of data can help the model, actually accurately project, under future conditions, when climate changes from one point to another point, how could the forest how fast or how slow can forest grow, right? So those are in other words, we are trying to use the spatial variation in place of temporal variation, limited temporal variation we have in the data. So this is actually a commonly employed approach in modeling in ecological modeling. So and we are making use of this type of the data and the information to help our model project, how forest would grow under different climate conditions in the future.
I see. So basically, basically more data is better.
Oh yes, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Liang, for letting me interview you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Brian.